My wife is great at keeping the house clean, but when it comes to real leadership, she's dead weight." The entire banquet hall erupted into easy laughter. Over 200 active duty service members, officers, and defense contractors chuckled along as my husband of 15 years, Master Sergeant Mark Holloway, raised his glass on stage at his own retirement gala. I sat alone at the edge of the VIP table in a simple navy dress, hands resting flat against my lap, staring down at my untouched plate. Mark flashed his charming, arrogant grin to the crowd, basking in their applause, convinced I was nothing more than an obedient housewife living off his pension dreams. Then the heavy brass doors of the ballroom slammed open. A 3-star base commander walked in, stopped dead in his tracks, locked eyes with me, and barked an order that made Mark's glass shatter on the stage. "My name is Evelyn Miller. I am 38 years old, and for 15 years, I played the part of the devoted, invisible military wife to Master Sergeant Mark Holloway. When you spend over a decade in military housing, people build a very specific narrative about who you are. To our neighbors on base, to Mark's subordinates, and especially to Mark himself, I was just the quiet woman who folded laundry, kept the lawn pristine, and packed lunches. Mark loved that narrative. He fed off it. In his mind, he was the sole warrior and provider, while I was simply the dependent tagalong who would be entirely helpless without his uniform and his paycheck. I never argued with him. I never corrected him when he claimed all our financial stability was solely because of his discipline. I just smiled, poured his coffee, and let him believe his own fantasy. Tonight was his official retirement banquet at the Base Officer Club. Over 200 active duty personnel, high-ranking officers, defense contractors, and their spouses filled the chandelier-lit hall. Mark stood at the center podium under the glaring stage lights, looking polished in his crisp dress uniform, chest lined with service ribbons. He held a glass of champagne in one hand and gripped the microphone with the other, soaking in the admiration of every junior enlisted soldier in the room. 15 years in uniform teaches a man the true meaning of leadership and sacrifice. Mark boomed into the microphone, his voice dripping with practiced bravado. He glanced down at the front VIP table where I sat in a modest navy dress, staring quietly at my plate. A smug, condescending grin crept across his face. "Of course, every soldier needs a home to come back to. My wife Evelyn is wonderful at keeping the kitchen spotless and making sure dinner is on the table, but let's be honest. When it comes to real ambition, strategy, or leadership, she's dead weight. Someone has to carry the heavy load, right?" The room erupted into casual, drunken laughter. Mark chuckled along with them, winking as if it were harmless banter. I didn't flinch. I simply set my fork down and took a slow breath, letting the silence settle around me. Mark thought he was crushing my spirit on the biggest night of his life. He had no idea the clock on his entire reality had just run out. The reason I stayed quiet while Mark belittled me was simple. The work I did wasn't something you talked about over dinner, and it certainly wasn't something Mark's fragile ego could ever handle. While Mark spent his 15-year career managing motor pool logistics and barking orders at junior mechanics, I held a doctorate in systems engineering from MIT. For over a decade, I operated as a senior civilian defense contractor and systems architect attached to DARPA and USANDOPACOM. I worked from a locked, soundproofed home office in the back of our house, protected by biometric scanners, high-grade encryption, and strict federal non-disclosure agreements. Mark thought I was running an Etsy shop or doing basic data entry. When he saw closed doors, he simply assumed I was wasting time, never once bothering to ask what kept the lights on when his paycheck barely covered the mortgage on his luxury truck. In reality, I designed the automated supply chain optimization architecture that modern military installations relied on for global rapid deployment protocols. When an entire base needed emergency resupply routing under severe logistical threat, they were running code I authored. I had briefed Pentagon liaisons while Mark was asleep on the couch, and I had received commendations delivered in classified courier envelopes while he was out bragging at the local dive bar. Mark's arrogance was a shield for his mediocrity. He had spent years pushing me into the background because he couldn't stand the idea of a woman outshining him. Whenever I brought up our future or tried to discuss my thoughts on strategy, he would wave his hand dismissively, telling me to leave the real thinking to men with rank. I let him believe it. I needed the quiet to do my job, and frankly, watching him construct his own pedestal of false pride had become a masterclass in patience. Now back in the officer club banquet hall, Mark stepped away from the podium and walked over to the defense contractor's table, laughing loudly and slapping backs. He was already pitching himself as a high-value logistics consultant, basking in the glow of his cheap joke at my expense. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, checked the time on my watch and watched him smile. He thought he was untouchable. He had no idea the room was about to shift. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the heavy double oak doors at the back of the banquet hall swung wide open. A crisp, unmistakable silence rippled outward from the entryway, cutting straight through the background jazz music and clinking silverware. 2 armed military police officers stepped through first, clearing the threshold with rigid posture, followed immediately by Lieutenant General Bradley Vance, the 3-star base commander. Vance was flanked by his senior executive aide and the regional director of naval logistics. 3 silver stars gleamed sharply under the chandelier lights against the crisp black fabric of his service uniform. Mark practically dropped his drink onto a server's tray. His eyes widened with an immediate predatory excitement. 4 months, Mark had been trying to schedule an introductory exit meeting with General Vance's administrative staff, desperate to secure an endorsement for a 6-figure defense consulting role. To Mark, the general's unexpected appearance at a master sergeant's retirement banquet was the ultimate stroke of personal luck. A stage handed directly to him. Smoothing his jacket and throwing his shoulders back, Mark marched straight toward the entryway. He plastered on his widest, most deferential grin, puffed out his chest, and extended his right hand with aggressive enthusiasm. "General Vance, sir. What an incredible honor to have you at my retirement event," Mark projected loudly, making sure every officer and contractor nearby heard him. "I'm Master Sergeant Mark Holloway, sir. It's been the privilege of a lifetime to serve this command." General Vance didn't even slow his stride. He looked directly through Mark's outstretched hand as if Mark were made of thin air, brushing past his shoulder without a single glance. Mark was left hanging mid-motion in front of dozens of watching subordinates, his arms suspended awkwardly in the empty space between them. The general marched with purpose straight toward the front row. He came to a dead stop directly in front of my table, snapped his boots together and locked his eyes onto mine. A collective gasp swept through the room as General Vance raised his hand in a sharp, formal salute. "Dr. Miller," Vance said, his voice deep, gravelly and commanding. He turned on his heel toward the 200 stunned officers and soldiers filling the hall and raised his voice until it echoed off every wall. "Room attention. All hands stand and render honors for the woman who saved this installation." The scrape of 200 chairs pushing back in unison sounded like rolling thunder. Every captain, major, colonel, and enlisted soldier in the room snapped instantly to their feet, locking into rigid attention. Mark stood off to the side, completely petrified. His jaw hung open, his eyes darting frantically between General Vance, the standing room, and me. The smug arrogance that had defined him for 15 years vanished in a single breath, replaced by sheer, suffocating terror. General Vance stepped aside and extended an open hand, inviting me to stand. I rose smoothly from my chair, smoothed down my dress and returned the general's nod. Vance then took the microphone from the podium, his stern gaze sweeping across the silent banquet hall. "Most of you know Dr. Evelyn Miller as a quiet base spouse." General Vance's voice resonated through the speakers. "What only the highest tier of Joint Command knows is that Dr. Miller is the principal architect of the Agile Supply Protocol, the exact logistics defense grid that prevented our forward supply chain from total catastrophic failure during Operation Iron Shield 3 years ago. Her systems averted a multi-million-dollar collapse and directly saved the lives of 400 soldiers in the Pacific Theater. Her NDA was officially declassified as of 0800 this morning." A wave of astonished murmurs broke through the discipline of the room. The corporate defense contractors, the very executives Mark had spent the entire evening attempting to schmooze, stared at me with genuine reverence, hastily jotting down notes. The lucrative consulting opportunities Mark had envisioned for himself evaporated on the spot. These executives realized instantly who had actually possessed the strategic intellect in our household all along. Mark looked like he was about to collapse. He staggered up toward the stage, his voice cracking into a desperate whisper. "Evelyn, what is this? Why didn't you tell me? I'm your husband." I took the microphone from General Vance with a polite smile, looking directly at the man who had called me dead weight only 20 minutes earlier. "Thank you, General Vance, and thank you to everyone here for your service," I said calmly, my voice steady and clear through the sound system. Then I turned toward Mark, reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp, sealed manila envelope. I placed it directly into his trembling hands. "Happy retirement, Mark. Those are the divorce papers. My attorney will handle the division of assets on Monday." Mark stood frozen under the stage lights, holding the manila envelope as if it were a primed grenade. The room erupted into a deafening standing ovation, not for his retirement, but for the quiet woman he had spent a decade diminishing. I didn't stay to watch him crumble. I gave General Vance a respectful nod, walked down the center aisle through rows of applauding officers, and exited into the cool evening air. The fallout was swift and absolute. When Mark finally came home that night, the smug bravado was entirely gone. He cornered me in the hallway, pleading, stammering through excuses, and claiming his comment at the podium had just been a bad joke taken out of context. He begged me to retract the divorce, to talk to the defense contractors on his behalf, to give him a second chance. But I had already seen through him years ago. There was no rage in my voice, only total finality. I packed my essentials and left him standing alone in the house he falsely claimed to have built. The divorce proceedings were finalized in less than 3 months. Because my defense contracts and patents were ironclad, pre-established intellectual property, Mark walked away with only his military pension and the realization that his inflated status was entirely unearned. The private defense firms he had dreamed of consulting for never returned his calls. In a high-stakes industry built on trust and competence, nobody wanted a man who had publicly belittled the very systems architect they were trying to hire. As for me, my transition out of the classified shadows was liberating. Free from the constant weight of protecting a fragile man's pride, I accepted a role as Senior Director of Strategic Systems at a leading aerospace firm, with full public recognition and an advisory seat on the Joint Logistics Board. Sometimes people confuse quiet dedication with weakness. They think silence means you have nothing to offer and patience means you have nowhere else to go. Mark spent 15 years convinced I was just dead weight along for the ride. In the end, he learned the hard way that when you push away the foundation holding you up, the only direction left to fall is down.